So, the other day, I made a video going over BuzzFeed's top 51 fantasy series of all time. I was actually pleasantly surprised by the list because I had very, very low expectations going in, but I figured it'd be a good idea to go to a much more credible source for fantasy books, in my opinion, especially with discussion and overall ranking. And so I decided to go to the r/fantasy subreddit and look at their list for the top 50 fantasy books of all time. For some reason, they didn't do tiebreakers, and so they all voted, and there's a bunch of ties, so the list is actually much closer to 100 books. So I'm going to be very choosy with what I talk about. There will be some redundancy from what I talked about in the BuzzFeed list, because of course they have some of the same books. Quick caveat beforehand, they have a strong bias on r/fantasy for modern fantasy, which is fine. I mean, we are in a renaissance right now of just constant and incredible fantasy books. I mean, it's unreal how frequently we are getting very, very good series, literally too many to read, and there wasn't that before. But in my opinion, there should be some classic fantasy books on this list that they just don't have. And a warning for some of you, Lord of the Rings is not number one. I know that made a couple people mad before. But diving in, the first book I'm familiar with enough to talk about is actually a Brandon Sanderson one, and that is The Emperor's Soul at 48. Emperor's Soul is a okay Brandon Sanderson book. Granted, his okay is better than most people's best, so it's still definitely worth reading. Would I put it in my top 50? No. Would I put it in my top 100? Yeah, maybe. That's a much bigger list. And then next up, we have a series that didn't even make BuzzFeed's list, and I'm actually in agreement with BuzzFeed on that, and that is the Percy Jackson and the Olympians series. The whole series kind of was unoriginal in my mind. It would not be in my top 50, probably in my not in my top 100. I would give that a negative review. But moving on, we have Breaker and Elantras, which I'm much bigger fans of. I think Breaker is where Brandon Sanderson, if you look at the order of books coming out, it's one of his earlier ones, and it's where he really started to find his stride in my mind. I think he knocked it out of the park with Breaker, and Elantras is also very, very good. They're right next to each other. They're literally tied, which the fact that Brandon Sanderson is frequently on this list enough to tie himself really shows you how prolific he is as an author right now. But I'm a big fan of both those books, and I would rate them very closely, so I have no problem with them taking that spot on the list. And then we have a book that I would put way higher, and that is The Princess Bride. Again, this is their kind of bias towards modern fantasy showing, I think, in terms of originality and unique tone and all these things. I think The Princess Bride should be much higher. The Foundation universe is on this list, which confuses me a little bit. I would not classify that as fantasy, but hey, if you're going to classify as fantasy, it absolutely belongs in this list and maybe even a little higher, but I wouldn't have thought to put it there. Next up, we have The Inheritance Cycle. I talked about this a bit in my last video, but again, I would not rate this nearly as high as it is on this list. I think The Inheritance Cycle lacks originality to the point where it cripples the story. Christopher Paolini wrote this when he was extremely young, so his influences stand out a lot, to the point where every aspect of his book seems to be heavily influenced, and the originality is seriously lacking. I'm also not a huge fan of character development in The Inheritance Cycle. It's not deep, and he was extremely young when he wrote it, and I think that makes it all the more incredible that it's as good as it is, because I wouldn't say it's bad. I would just say it's clear that it was written by a younger guy. Redwall, on the other hand, I would put much, much higher. I'm a huge fan of Redwall, and I think it's pretty much, as I said before, the exact opposite of Inheritance Cycle in terms of it's extremely original, a whole lot of character packed into animals, and it's just fun. Like, Redwall is so much fun, and if you've been watching my channel, you know I give books a lot of credit for just being fun. If you can make your audience enjoy the ride no matter what's going on, you've won half the battle as an author. And I don't know of anyone who's read Redwall that didn't at least kind of have a smile reading it. Next up, we have the Chronicles of Narnia. There's two kinds of classic fantasy. There is classic fantasy that has influenced a whole lot of what we read today and is aged really well, and Chronicles of Narnia does not fall into that kind. It falls into the kind that hasn't aged so well, and in my opinion, hasn't really influenced much. So yeah, for Chronicles of Narnia, I'm just not feeling a whole lot of love. Next up, we have American Gods by Neil Gaiman. This is probably one of the biggest surprises on my channel for books that I've read and reviewed, because I went in with kind of medium expectations. I heard it was good. I heard the TV show was really good. And I was like, all right, I'll give it a try. And what I ended up reading, in my opinion, was one of the most original fantasy books in terms of execution of the concept of having these older gods in modern society. Following the main character was also just so well done, because his curiosity and ignorance was the reader's, and the way that he ended up developing his relationship with the gods and the understanding of the universe around him felt like how the reader was. It was an interesting reflection that I think Neil Gaiman executed marvelously. Next up, we have His Dark Materials, which is a book that, again, some people have started hating on in the fantasy community, and I just don't think it's deserved at all. His Dark Materials, in my opinion, for its time, stood head and shoulders above the crowd, and for modern day writing, I feel like still is above the average and is above par for what people expect for the fantasy genre. I think it deserves maybe even be a little higher on this list. But next up, we have a confusing pick. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I would never think of when choosing a fantasy top 50 list, and I would put it substantially higher. I love Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I think it's, in terms of humor and execution of a ridiculous concept, a blast. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy still has not been outdone in terms of what it tried to do, because it was the first book I'm aware of to just kind of be this crazy, cosmos, nihilistic, hilarious, amazing experience. And there's been a whole lot of things that copied, but nothing has really kind of lived up to it on that level. I'm well aware I need to read The Dark Tower. I have not yet. It's on the list. It's quite a bit down the list, but it is on there. In terms of things that made me happy I started this channel, Lightbringer is so high up there, because I would not have found it if it wasn't for you guys, and it's become one of my top series of all time. In terms of character, Lightbringer is a Goliath. Everyone in this series, from the main characters to the side characters, is just dripping with personality, and their motivations are flushed out, and the villains are so well done. You kind of get it, and you're a little bit behind them too, and it's scary that you are. The main character's internal conflict is something that you could write pages on pages about. It's so freakishly well done, and I came out of nowhere for me. Lightbringer, in every aspect, to me, is what fantasy should strive to be. It is original, it's fun, it's intricate, it's massive in scope. Brent Weeks, when he made Lightbringer, made something special, and I hope Brent Weeks continues to write, because everything he puts out I will pick up, because his writing so far has blown me out of the water. Dune, my most disliked book review, I think, outside of Kingkiller, because I wasn't a huge fan. It just never struck a chord with me. I get that for its time, it was super original and super big in scope, and really no one had tried anything like it before. But for me, it just never really landed. I'm able to put it in the context of its time. I understand how great and original it was for then, but that doesn't mean I have to enjoy it, and I just didn't. Discworld is on my list to read, and I will get to it right after I read The First Law, the next pick on this list, because everyone and their mother in my last video told me I have to read First Law. So after my reread of Game of Thrones, I will go ahead and pick up The First Law. Wheel of Time comes in at number 8. That's a fair placement. My personal list would be much higher, but I get it. I like seeing Gentlemen Bastards this high as well. I think Gentlemen Bastards, in terms of execution of following the bad guys, is the best done in fantasy, period. It feels like Ocean's 11 done better. Tons of fun, amazing characters, and a story you will never be able to predict. Mistborn at number 6. I would not have it this high. I get why it is this high, but Era 2 really brought it down for me. Over time, I've really fallen in love with Era 1, and Era 2 was just so painfully predictable for me that I couldn't love it the way I did Era 1. Of course, if you've seen my reviews, I still really enjoyed it, though, and I still give Brandon Sanderson all the praise in the world for writing such a fun experience in terms of Era 2. I think it just doesn't hold a candle to Era 1, especially with how strong the ending was for Era 1. Harry Potter, great choice. I might even put it a little higher. It's a wonderful series. It's changed the fantasy genre forever, and is a whole lot of you reading's probably first introduction to the genre. wonderfully well done. I don't like that it's becoming cool to hate Harry Potter. That does not give you credibility as a fantasy critic to come out and hate on it. I mean, you can say you didn't enjoy it, but saying it's bad is just wrong. It's so well done and so much fun and so whimsical, because I really can't think of a better word to describe it. Harry Potter really does deserve the high praise it gets. All right, number 4. I see you. I'm not going to agree with it, but I see it. Number 3, we have Lord of the Rings. I would put it at number 1 because I really praise books and hold them higher for influence, and it's unquestionable that Lord of the Rings, in terms of Western fantasy, is the most influential book, period. No argument can be made otherwise. But that being said, if you didn't enjoy it as much to put it at number 1, that's totally fair. Number 2, we have Stormlight, and yeah, that's thoroughly earned. Stormlight is, freaking Stormlight. It's shaping up to quickly become a classic before it's even finished. It's becoming a staple of the genre. It's Brandon Sanderson's magnum opus. It's going to be known as his Lord of the Rings, his Wheel of Time, and it makes everyone so excited for the Cosmere as a whole that I can't really knock it from being number 2. It'd probably be number 2 on my list. It might even be above Wheel of Time in my list. And then number 1, you have A Song of Ice and Fire, which I'm currently in the middle of a reread of. You can't really argue with A Song of Ice and Fire in current fantasy times is the number 1 fantasy book in a lot of ways. It's shaping the way the genre is going to look for the next 20 years. Authors are going to be trying to copy that darker tone, that gritty realism, that intense passion that George R. R. Martin brings into his writing because it is so popular now. Do I personally think it's the greatest? No, I don't enjoy it as much as I do many others, but I respect the hell out of Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire, and all those books, so I don't disagree with it entirely being number 1. That is my review of r/Fantasy's top 100, I think, books. Some very good picks, some very interesting picks. King Killer Chronicles. I hope you guys like this video. I'm not going to do a bunch more of these, top whatever lists. I just thought it'd be interesting to do a more credible source, and r/Fantasy for me is probably the most credible source when it comes to discussion and, recommendations. It's where I used to go before I had this channel, and all of you beautiful bastards, as Philip DeFranco would say, giving me these great recommendations. Hope you guys like this video. Like and subscribe. Share it wherever you want to share it if you can. Patreon is linked down below. Hope you guys are having a great day. I hope you had a good weekend, and I'll see you soon. Peace.